Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. We are so delighted. My name is Leticia Vandepute, and no stranger to the Capitol with just been blessed with 24 years of service on the House. So thank you to the members and the folks who are attending today, and a special thank you to all of the staff. We are excited to really introduce you to the leadership and the members of a wonderful organization, the Texas Affiliation of Affordable Housing Providers. This group does fantastic work of providing quality housing that serves our Texas working families, our senior citizens, and so many veterans. You all are very much aware of the extraordinary position that we all face this year, grappling with the budget deficit, a little bit of our shortfalls due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and only making matters worse, it's been particularly difficult on the service industries, the hospitality industries, and the retail sector industries. But as we all know, we really didn't have enough of quality workforce housing to begin with. And the impact of this pandemic has exacerbated those issues that existed before the pandemic occurred, and really making matters worse. And while many of the Texas residents who I know call your legislative offices at the district and here at the Capitol all the time, they're in crisis. And I know that there's only so much that you and the staff can do to help get folks back on their feet. But we know to get the pandemic on hand, the vaccinations are happening, and we will need to spur the economic activity to help Texas get back to where it belongs. So please join me today in welcoming TAAHP's esteemed leadership. We have with us President Janine Cisak of DMA Companies and our President-elect Chris Akbari of the ITEX Group. Additionally, we are so honored to have with us today my friend and House member leader in these issues as our special guest, House Representative Shawn Thierry, to help us with a very strong start to this program. Also with us today is our Executive Director of the Texas Affiliation of Affordable Housing Providers, Roger Arriaga. So thank you very much, and I'd like to turn it over right now to our President, Janine Cisak. Janine?
Thank you, Senator Vandepute. Welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. And a special thanks to our speakers for their expertise and time today. Before handing it over to Chris and Representative Thierry, I would like to provide some background on why we are offering this programming today. In prior legislative sessions, our organization would host a rally day sometime in March at the Capitol in person so that our members could speak directly to elected officials about the importance of our housing industry. This year, we with a virtual way to reach out, and so we devised a multi-step approach, this step being step one, a high-level educational webinar about our industry and the role it plays in the Texas economy and its recovery. This webinar is designed specifically for today's audience, which includes both TAAHP members and Texas elected officials and their staff. We are hopeful that both groups take away fundamental information from this webinar that is helpful in understanding our industry. The second step will occur in March when TAAHP will facilitate virtual but smaller group meetings with our members and state representatives and senators and their staff to further discuss specifics about TAAHP's legislative priorities. That will be an opportunity for all to dive deeper into the technical aspects of any proposed legislation and for everybody to ask questions. So with that background to set the stage, I'll hand it over to Roger, who's going to make some announcements. Thanks.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Roger Arriaga, Executive Director of TAAHP, the Texas Affiliation of Affordable Housing Providers. I have a few housekeeping items before we get started. At the conclusion of this webinar, please complete our survey. These surveys help us improve our future programming. We want to be a good resource for our elected officials and our industry partners. We also have a recording of this webinar so that you can view it at your convenience if you want a refresher later on. Also, if any of our representatives or their staff members have any questions, please use the chat box in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we're going to do our best to get to all the questions and get you an answer. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors. It is their support that's made this program possible, and we cannot be more grateful to them. Please help me thank DMA Companies, ITEX Group, Tropicana Properties, Blazer Building, Commonwealth Multifamily Housing Corporation, Community Housing Resource Partners, NRP Construction, and Shackelford Law. As you'll see in the handout section, there'll be a copy of this PowerPoint that we'll be reviewing today, so you'll have it there for your resource. Also, please note that one of our most important programs that we do with TAAHP is we provide scholarships for students living in communities developed by TAAHP members. Last year, we gave over $52,000 in scholarships for these students who are attending colleges and universities across Texas. And so they already live in affordable housing, and they've seen some of the crises that we're dealing with, and we're trying to do our best to give them an opportunity with college and higher level education. You'll see in the handouts section that there'll be a short video there that highlights last year's recipients. We hope you'll take a look at it. It's about a 4-minute video. Thank you again for joining us today. Chris Akbari, we're going to turn it over to you and Representative Thierry. Thanks.
Thank you, Roger. Representative Thierry, thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us today. First, I'd like to let everyone know who doesn't know Representative Thierry that she is the first and only woman who's been elected to House District 146. It's a diverse district that covers a large portion of Houston. In fact, Representative, I currently reside in the next district over from you. You've successfully passed and raised national awareness on maternal mortality affecting women of color. And thank you for that. Also, last session, you offered 57 bills on a wide range of issues, including public health, economic development, anti-human trafficking, mental health, and public education. Representative Thierry is actually serving her 3rd term in the Texas House. Last session, Representative Thierry was appointed to 3 influential committees in the House, the Transportation Committee, as well as the Land and Resource Management Committee, the House Administration, and the House Administration Committee. We're so excited to have her here today, and also to have her in the legislature. On a personal note, she is a mother of an 8-year-old daughter, Claire, and she's been a practicing attorney for 25 years. Representative Thierry was recently named one of the most effective legislators in Texas and is one of the top 30 most influential women in Houston and has been named a rising star in Texas and national politics. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, Representative.
Thank you so much, Chris. I feel like saying after that wonderful introduction, just boom, that's it, drop the mic. I don't know where to go from there, but thank you so much. Thank you, Senator Vanderputte. I really appreciate you reaching out. Thank you to all of the leadership at TAAHP and to all of your members for having me today. It's really just my pleasure and my privilege to be able to join you today. And I hope that we can just make this informal. I know we've got a Q&A, but I just, my biggest goal today is to really get to know me and feel that you have a resource here in the House. And I would like to say an open door policy, but we'll get to that in a little bit later, that it's not quite physically open due to COVID, but I'm still very available to you. And so I just want you to know that I'm working hard and would love to hear more about the legislative priorities for TAAHP this session.
Well, outside of the bio, I did a little bit of research, Representative, and many of the people that serve with you, other legislators, think very highly of you, both Democrats and Republicans. So that says a lot about you, as well as I talked to some of the local partners I have and friends here in Houston, and all of those that know you think very highly of you. So we're so blessed to have you here today.
Thank you very much. That means a lot. You know, you all, just as a point of personal privilege, I'll tell you, when I got into politics, or should I say when I won this seat as the first woman, my family was very excited, but there was some hesitation on even my dad's part at the time. Ray, rest in peace. And he said, you know, this is such an ugly business sometime. You know, it's hard to make friends and easy to make enemies. And so one thing that I have been happy to say is that in my experience thus far, I have made some friends on both sides of the aisle, and that's been really refreshing. And so I try to maintain that spirit.
Well, we appreciate that. And I did want to kind of hop into some of the questions that we have. So, you know, again, congratulations on your third legislative session. I know it's going to be much different than the other sessions that we've had before, but given the limitations on the meetings at the Capitol, how do you think that it might affect this legislative session, and how it might affect you and some of your priorities as an advocate and some of the other legislative priorities that you have?
Well, you know, there's no way around it. It's a real challenge right now. We're still kind of going through the weeds and finding our way. The House did pass rules in terms of kind of the rules of engagement of how we would manage this session. So from a safety precaution standpoint, you know, we are all masked up. It's up to each individual member, however, with respect to testing. The logistics aspects of having advocates and lobbyists and the public coming in and out of offices has been left up to each individual member. But we've already had, as most people know, it's been reported 2 incidences of, you know, COVID on the House. So most members are asking folks to just make an appointment. And that's the protocol I've been following. And that's worked out. We've done a number of Zooms, just like we're doing today. So it's going to challenge it. It's a challenge, but I have said that my recommendation is for people to really pick what matters the most. Speaker Phelan has already said that it's going to be a very lean session, and so that's affected my agenda as well. You mentioned in the onset, I like to write bills, and it's just my forte, my background. I love policy. But I've pre-filed, I think, about 24 now, but I'm going to have 25, but I'm going to obviously have to, you know, whittle that down as well. So I would encourage you, TAAHP, to really, really do some soul searching and find out what's most important to you this session, because we're, you know, the House or the Senate, we're not going to be able to pass the number of bills that we would typically do when we were not in a pandemic.
Great. And, you know, are there any lessons that you think you've learned from the 2 previous sessions that you think are going to help you in this session?
Sure. You know, you touched on it a little bit a moment ago, and it's something we've been seeing on the national level. In Texas, I would say, at least from the standpoint of the House, we're really not like DC. And so one of the lessons that I learned early on is that you really have to work on both sides of the aisle. The bipartisanship is the only way to be effective. And so it is different. We eat together. Well, we haven't quite done that with COVID, but in past sessions, you would see people on both sides of the aisle eating together in the members' lounge, you know, serving on committees back in their district outside of the House, working together on other issues where we find common ground. And so that, to me, and I can only speak for myself because everybody has a different philosophy about this, but my takeaway was that if you can find common ground, you can be a lot more effective, because we already know where we disagree. And in those instances, we split and we vote our district, and the board, you know, the numbers fall where they may. But when you have an opportunity to work on issues that affect all Texans, urban and rural, meat and potatoes issues, things like affordable housing, I think it's really, really important that you reach out to all members and not pigeonhole yourself. So that was my biggest takeaway from the first session. I ended up having allies on legislation that people told me would never be supportive, and they absolutely were.
I think that says a lot about you. I would also like to inquire, I know you said you had 25 bills that you're already working on, but can you give us a little bit more detail into some of your goals that you have for this session?
Yes, so I 25 is streamlined so far for me. I've pre-filed bills and I filed a couple of new ones. I'm really working a lot. I'll continue to work in the public health space. Economic development kind of crosses over in my mind in a couple of areas. So for example, my district is very diverse, as you mentioned, but there are several food deserts in my district. And so I have legislation that would provide businesses a tax credit if they were to build grocery stores in areas that meet the federal definition of a food desert. So that's one. One of my other priority pieces of legislation is dealing with the middle skills gap that Governor Abbott has talked about. And so we want to keep Texas competitive. So what this bill does, and it kind of ties into pub ed, is take the funding from our skills development fund and allow it to work with a nonprofit, and then they partner with school districts, and they're able to pay private employers, give them the funding to be able to pay students for apprenticeships. So they get internships, they get trade, they get earn while you learn, and it's a win-win for everyone. It's a very innovative project. This is all for CTE, and so that's another bill that I'll be pushing this session. I've got, gosh, a myriad of legislation. We talked about anti-human trafficking. I was on a big Zoom yesterday with Thompson, Ms. T, Senator Huffman, Tan Parker, again, a bipartisan coalition. We're all going to be pushing for stronger anti-human trafficking legislation. Gosh, we've got just an array of bills. So I try to streamline them, but I'm very passionate about them. And I'll tell you a little anecdote. When my freshman year, I didn't know that Ledge Council would write all the bills for you. And so having been a lawyer, I would literally write and draft my own bills. And so finally one day they called me and they said, Representative Thierry, you know, you can just put what you want it to do and we'll do that. And I said, well, nobody told me. So it made life a lot easier, but I'm kind of addicted to it too. So sometimes you'll see a lot of the legislation. I sit at home and I'll put my daughter to bed and I'll write it on my iPhone, and even if it's 30 pages long. So I always make a point to tell my constituents and groups like yourself, though, please let me know, and come to me and we can sit down and draft a bill right here and there, right here in the office.
That's very neat. So I know that your interests have always been aligned with helping underserved Texans, and I realized from reading your bio that you've been there to help with both health issues and equal opportunity issues, as well as opioid crises. I'm just wondering, are there any other critical issues that have presented themselves due to the pandemic that you think are things that we need to really focus on as Texans this session?
Are you asking outside of the housing area, just as, in terms of COVID as a whole?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. You might recall last March, I wrote a letter to Governor Abbott when I noticed some disturbing trends with what was going on with the COVID-19 pandemic, and that had to deal with the disparities, the healthcare disparities. We started to see that African Americans and Latino community were being disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And so at that time, I asked the governor if he would create a racial disparities task force to directly take on this issue. He did not do that. However, as a result of my efforts, he commissioned a study with the Health and Human Services Commission and directed them to look into this issue and to study the trends on vulnerable populations. And so I'm happy to report, I've been in talks with them for months. I just had a briefing with them last Friday. They released phase 1 of the findings, and it is on par with what we knew, unfortunately, which is that the Latino community is disproportionately being affected, and also a great number of the fatalities, the mortalities, the African American community as well. So what we want to do when we get all those findings, what I plan to do is to advocate that resources go directly to these populations so that we can get a handle on this and create more health equity. So that's something I would like people to be mindful of, because now that pivots directly to the issue that you've heard about on the news, which is vaccine distribution. Tomorrow I'll be in my district volunteering at a very well-run mobile drive-through vaccine site at NRG Stadium, which is right in the heart of my district where all the Houston Tech football games are played. And Herman Memorial Hospital, which is also in my district, I represent a portion of the medical center, has partnered with NRG, and they are able to do up to 10,000 vaccines a day. So far, we haven't had enough, but we've done 3,000 a day. So I'll be there tomorrow working with them. But what we want to ensure, though, is that it's equitable. And so that brings me to another bill, House Bill 202. I filed that bill to reestablish the Office of Health Equity, to make that a statewide office as well. So I would just encourage everyone to be very mindful as we move through this pandemic, that we are mindful that we do it in an equitable way. I know President Biden gave a speech yesterday on racial equity, and so I was happy to see that. But I tell people, you don't have to be sympathetic to the group, even if you want to be completely selfish. This is an infectious disease. So if one community has it, it's going to affect you. If one person has it, it's still going to affect you. So as Texans, this is an issue where we all have to join hands. Well, I won't say join hands because we're social distancing, but where we all have to work together to eradicate COVID-19.
Thank you. As you probably know, we represent housing providers, but housing is a stability for Texans that we are all so proud to provide. And a lot of us, we provide supportive services to the residents that have to do with both education and both healthcare and initiatives to assist with that. So please bear in mind as you're working through those programs, if there's anything that we as the housers of Texans can do for low to moderate income as well as workforce housing, please let us know. And we'd also like to mix in a few things relating to our program and the programs that we operate in. We're very interested in seeing affordable housing and workforce housing expanded here in Texas. For many, many years, there was a inability to build enough product that would stay up with the population growth here. And I just wonder, are there any opportunities to coordinate with some of the agendas that you're working on with affordable and workforce housing?
Absolutely. Again, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the need for more affordable housing. We've seen how so many families have lost their jobs as a result of this pandemic. And while I'll say that the federal and the state government has done a good job at addressing our most vulnerable populations with moratoriums on evictions, I still feel there's a piece that's missing, which is also making sure we provide some sort of cover and relief for developers who put themselves at personal risk, great risk, to build and construct housing projects. And so what I'm committed to do is to do my part to make sure that more money goes out of the door to rental assistance money so that these developers and property owners do not have to take such a financial hit. And I guess I would say that I could work with, Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs to try to identify nonprofits back in my district that will be able to provide rental assistance to folks in my district and throughout Texas. It can, I'm a big fan of pilot programs, and if you do something right in one area, then you use that as the gold standard to implement it throughout the state of Texas.
Also, I wanted to just ask you a few things about the House, and I know that today I think they went ahead and went on break until the 9th. And also, we're very aware of the new speaker. Just wondering what your thoughts are. Have you had a chance to work with the speaker before? And what do you think some of the challenges are that he faces this year in this session?
Well, obviously he's inheriting. I'll start with the challenges, and then I'll tell you about my opportunities to work with Speaker Phelan in the past. But it's obviously going to be a challenge. Just the fact that our freedom of movement is limited. The building itself is eerily quiet. So things aren't moving at the speed of light, but yet our responsibility is the same. We still got to pass a budget. We have about $1 billion shortfall. It's not as bad as what we thought, but we do know that many agencies are going to see cuts. So he has a lot to handle. He's made the comment before that his job is to call balls and strikes, and so to that point, I feel that he'll be very fair on that order. I have a little funny story about Speaker Phelan. Well, last session, I was on the House floor one night, and I was putting an amendment to the budget on a bill that would provide some mental health funding to community-based programs. And he came right up to me and he said, "Hey, Shawn, my wife told me to come down here and help you with this amendment." She called me at my desk, and it was very kind of similar to the story that Representative Collier told on opening day. So I guess that goes to say that Kim is heavily involved, and he joked about it. So he listens to her. So I appreciated that. And he did. He stood right by my desk. I told him what it was about. And he said, "Well, let me know what I can do." I said, "Well, I'm going to go up to the front mic and ask the author if she'll accept this friendly amendment, but I also need the body if that doesn't happen to support." And he said, "Well, let me go up there and stand with you." And it was great. And then from that moment, it opened the door for a conversation about flood mitigation and Hurricane Harvey, because both of our districts were so heavily impacted by it. And so, he's from the Golden Triangle area, and we just had a great conversation. My aunt lived in Beaumont for 40 years. So I told him about that. And so we just started talking about how our districts, while different, some of the issues are the same. Our constituents care about, flood mitigation projects and jobs and good schools and safe neighborhoods. And so we found common ground right then. And from that point on, it was very easy for me to support Speaker Phelan from the very beginning when he was running for speaker.
Great, thank you. And just one last question. Any advice you might have for any of the incoming freshmen?
So I've already let the cat out the bag. About a month ago, before we started session, they had freshman orientation. And so Speaker Phelan, his office called and asked me if I would participate in giving some advice to the freshmen during the orientation session. So I came down, and I believe what I said and what I still feel is the most important thing is just to be very careful about who you say things about and who you say things to. It will come back. And, they make the joke that this is like Capitol High, like Capitol High School. But I shared that even if you have a strong disagreement with a member, just disagree on the policy. Don't hop on social media and attack that person's character or call them a blankety blank blank blank, because there's going to come a time when you're going to need to work with that member. And depending on how far you go or how far you went, you may have closed the door to where the person just is unwilling to deal with you. And so I talked about that and said that, you know, while we're all here to represent our districts aggressively, and you can get on the back mic and make your point, that I believe you can do that in a way where you can still do it with integrity, and you don't attack someone's character to the point that there's nowhere else to go but home.
That is such refreshing advice considering the political environment we've watched these past few years. So thank you for that.
And it happens. You know, we've seen people get into almost fist fight, and I get it, but I also said that be mindful of the fact that if you see someone doing that, they may have been in this place for 20 years or 30 years, and so they have a lot more leeway to, you know, do a little trash talking. And I said, and some of that sometimes is theater, you know, don't get so caught up in the hype, you know, that you go running back there, you know, like a lamb to the slaughter. And because it's not going to be received the same for people who really don't know you. And, you know, you just got here. So I said, you know, just be mindful of that. You know, you can be aggressive, you can be a warrior, you can be a fighter, but, you know, don't go for the jugular in a way that's a cheap shot, because people will remember that about you. And then I gave the advice that you all probably have heard 1,000 times, which is, you know, your word is your bond. Keep your word. If you say you're going to do something, or you make a promise, you know, do your very level best to keep it. And if you can't, woman up and go straight to the person and let them know why you're unable to do that.
Excellent. Well, Representative, we really appreciate your time, and this was a great conversation with you. It's really good to meet you, and we look forward to working with you throughout this legislative session. So,
thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. And again, in the district before COVID, we had something, I'll just tell you, we called it Welcome Wednesdays in the district office. And I would welcome the constituents on Wednesdays to come by, and we would do things like coffee and donuts, and you know, just talk about the things that were going on in the district that they maybe needed help with. But I would love to do something similar to that. But again, we're in different times. But it doesn't have to be Wednesday. We welcome you. Just give us a call, send us an email, and let me know what you need, and just consider me a friend.
we appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you all for inviting me. Thank you, Senator.
So next up on our agenda, we would like to invite both Thierry Anderson of Anderson Development, as well as, who, by the way, is a TAAHP board member and a member of the Government Affairs and Legislative Affairs Committee, as well as Membership Development, QAP, and Education. And also Lisa Stevens of Sagebrook Development, who is also on the Government Affairs and Compliance Committees, to go over our affordable housing and economic recovery presentation. And so, Thierry, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Lisa and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, wonderful, wonderful. You know, as we've all been saying all day, housing is the key to economic recovery in the state of Texas and quite frankly throughout the country. So Lisa and I would just like to walk you through some of the information that we have available, and we're so thankful that all of the representatives and senators are in attendance today. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, and I'll turn it over to Lisa to get us started.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Thierry. This afternoon, we're going to touch on what is affordable housing. Why do we need it? How does it get done here in the state of Texas? And in particular, what are the priorities for the Texas Affiliation of Affordable Housing and how you can help with those priorities in the upcoming session. So I'll start with, and Victoria, hopefully you can advance our slides for me. I'll start with what exactly is affordable housing. And affordable housing is targeted for primarily working families or seniors on a fixed income, disabled on a fixed income, who cannot quite afford market rate housing or home ownership, and yet they're overqualified for government programs or subsidized housing. Affordable housing in the environment we're talking about today is primarily rental housing, and the rent payments that residents make are based off of area median family income, or AMFI. You may also hear it abbreviated as AMI, area median income. This is an income band that is, or an income established by HUD, and traditionally it's segmented into 4 bands. The extremely low income, which is generally 0 to 30%, the very low income from 31% to 50%, then low income from 51 to 80, and moderate, which is 81 plus, oftentimes going up to 100 or 120% of the area median. The area median is actually established by HUD each year, and they publish it sometime around March or April annually. You can see in the slide we have in front of you, this is the 2020 area median incomes. HUD publishes it nationally. They publish it by state. They publish it by metropolitan statistical area or urban community, and then also by county. So we've given you a couple of comparables here. You'll see that the national area median income is roughly 78,000, versus the state of Texas area median income is roughly 74,000. Different communities, based on the data that HUD has, have different area median incomes. You'll find that smaller communities and rural communities historically have a lower median income than what you see published here for the urban areas. And if you happen to be curious about a particular income for a particular area, you can actually go to HUD's website, and they have a set of information called a data set. And you can look up the area median income for any particular area on that website. Affordable housing was created to help eliminate cost burden. So what does that mean? Cost burden is when a household pays more than 30% of their income on housing costs. And that housing cost includes not just their rent, but also their utilities. And if we're talking about home ownership, it could also include their insurance premiums or their mortgage insurance. So when we talk about cost burden, we're talking about a household that is spending more than 30% of their income just to cover their housing costs. And it's estimated that almost 50% of households in Texas are experiencing a cost burden situation. Unfortunately, over the last year, since COVID-19, we've actually seen the level of cost burden increase. With the pandemic, with layoffs, reduced hours, offices closing, folks having to work from home, incomes are reduced as well, and the loss in income creates a higher level of cost burden than we've experienced even in the most recent years. A lot of residents have been staying at home as their strategy for surviving the pandemic, but they're very concerned about being able to stay in their homes and being able to pay their rent. Affordable housing is one of the ways that we can help impact that stability that families need, and especially for children. There have been multiple studies that have proven that children, particularly from the ages of kindergarten through 5th grade, are very susceptible to movement, household movement, and having a stable home life actually increases the graduation rates for children. So affordable housing plays right into our long-term future generation success, and it is one of the reasons it's so important for us to tackle it now. The Census Bureau currently estimates that 43% of Texas households are having an issue covering their expenses today. And 40% of the residents who are behind on their rent are very concerned about eviction when the prohibition on eviction is listed. If you talk to some of the affordable housing owners in the state of Texas right now, they'll tell you that our rent collections are down and the number of residents who are behind on their rent is increasing, and it has continued to climb from the early days of the pandemic 11 months ago to where we're at today. That's occurring nationally. Many of us are working with our residents and nonprofits, churches, local, state, and city municipal governments to help try to find rental assistance for our residents to help them stay afloat and be able to catch up on their expenses. For communities to be economically healthy, we need housing at all levels and at all affordability levels. Many household wages don't actually meet the area median income. If you think about the chart that we looked at on slide number 2, a lot of those area median incomes were $70,000, $75,000. Yet a lot of households aren't making $70,000 a year, $75,000 a year. So they wind up being cost burdened because they're having to pay so much of their income to be able to afford their home, or they wind up having to move in with family, which is not a great living situation, although it works for some. Or they wind up in housing that they either can't afford or that really just isn't quality housing. So in order for our communities to be economically healthy and vibrant, it's important that we have a variety of housing types at different levels of affordability. The affordable housing program itself was not created for every housing level. I mentioned that it was created to fill the middle. It was created for folks who aren't traditionally served under the government programs that were in existence, and they can't afford market rate housing. Terry's going to give us a little bit of the history in a few minutes about how the program came into being, but it's important to understand that the affordable housing program is not the end-all be-all for everyone. It is specifically for those folks who are in that 30% to 80% AMI brackets, and that is traditionally the majority of the residents that we serve. Because affordable housing is created through new construction or through rehabilitation, it actually creates jobs during the time period that those developments are under construction or rehabilitation. There are so many different industries that actually participate within an affordable housing community and its development and construction period, that there's a huge multiplier associated with the economic activity for affordable housing. The National Home Builders Association estimates that for every dollar that is spent on affordable housing, we're actually generating an economic benefit for the local community of $12. 12 to 1 multiplier for economic benefit is huge, and one of the reasons that we believe that affordable housing can be part of the economic recovery plan. That multiplier for economic benefit actually is before you take into consideration the fact that a household who has a home that they can afford actually then has more residual income left to spend on other items that they need to support their family, whether it be school, shopping, groceries, insurance, all of those extras, sometimes necessities, that they need. The affordable housing frees up income for those families to be able to pay for those services. In Texas, the revenues generated by the 9% housing tax credit program are estimated to be more than $12 billion annually. And that's just one affordable housing program. Terry's going to talk to us in a few minutes about the difference between 4% housing tax credits and 9% housing tax credits, and how those two programs work together to provide affordable housing. but across all of the housing programs in the state of Texas, the estimated impact to the local economy is around $31 billion annually. So this is a huge economic revenue generator for the, not for the state of Texas. With that, Terry, I'm going to turn it over to you for a few minutes.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lisa. I appreciate it. As Lisa mentioned, I'm going to kind of walk through the basics of what tax credits are and how the program began. And the housing tax credit program was started in 1986, essentially to incentivize the development of affordable housing. This has been the most successful development program. Lisa and I had a discussion yesterday about what we were presenting today, and it's critically important to understand that the housing tax credit program is so effective. There's been less than 1% default rate on these developments since the beginning of the entire program. So it was started in 1986, and our housing tax credits are administered by the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. Annually, we receive approximately 65 million housing tax credits to be administered, and that's based on our population. So every state receives a housing tax credit allocation based on their actual population, and the overall benefit of that $65 million in housing tax credits is essentially multiplied by 10, because the value is $65 million times 10, which is sold in the open market. So it's $650 million annually that's coming into the state of Texas for the development of this housing. Next slide, please. So as Lisa mentioned, there are two different types of housing tax credits. One is the 9% very competitive housing tax credit, and that is what most of you all will actually receive phone calls from and have developers request a letter of support for, and that is also the competitive process that requires resolutions from local cities and local governments. And it's highly competitive based on scoring. In addition to the 9% tax credits, you have 4% housing tax credits. And where they're not a competitive housing tax credit, the bond that comes from tax-exempt bonds and the ceiling cap that's provided to the state of Texas has become more and more competitive as interest rates have lowered. And now that we have a flat 4% tax credit rate, more and more developments will actually become more competitive to apply to a local issuing authority and then apply to TDHCA for 4% credits to make those transactions feasible. Next slide, please. The way that a housing tax credit works is that the IRS will issue the tax credits, as I mentioned, based on the population for each state. Each developer for every development will have a specific application that is submitted to the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, and based on the standards that are created on an annual basis in our qualified allocation plan, those particular standards have to be met in order for our developments to be successful. The applications are awarded. The application process begins in January, so there is a pre-application process, and then the full applications are due not later than March 1st. And the final awards for those developments have to actually be awarded by the state of Texas prior to the end of July. So in order for a 9% housing tax credit development to be effective and meet the standards, we have to actually receive support from our state representatives where the project is located, as well as receive certain resolutions from the city councils or the local government if it's in an ETJ, for example. Next slide, please. Oh, we're not moving forward yet. So on the tax credit work, the way that the tax credits work, once you submit your application to TDHCA and TDHCA actually provides an award, the developer is able to take that award, The maximum amount for a tax credit application is $1.5 million per application. And as I mentioned, that value is taken over 10 years. And so the value to that particular development based on the amount of tax credits received would be $15 million, for example, if you received a $1.5 million credit. And that $1.5 million is then sold to a private investor who uses that tax credit in the future to offset their taxes. So if you've got a $25 million development, for example, you receive $15 million in housing tax credits, the developer is able to actually use the equity that's achieved from the investor as well as debt that's being provided for this $25 million development. We're not getting the same ratio that you would typically get on a market rate development where you have essentially an 80%, 20% type of scenario. We're doing the reverse. We're typically getting about 70% of the equity coming from a tax credit and 30% coming from debt. And what the benefit is of having lower debt on a development is the ability of the developer and property owner to charge lower rents. And that's where the economic benefit of the housing tax credit is translated into meeting the needs of Texans who have, as Lisa mentioned, incomes between 0 and 80%, but our typical target market is a 50% to 60% AMI resident. So we're able to lower the rents with less debt. And the IRS requires that that particular amount of affordability be maintained on the property for an initial 15-year compliance period, but we actually increased that in the state of Texas now up to, I believe, 40 years, so as much as 40 years. Next slide. So I may have gotten a little bit ahead of myself, but when we're looking through the overall development strategy for a 9% development, it's similar on a 4% tax credit development, but just like the difference is 4% versus 9%, we're actually having a higher amount of debt on a 4% tax credit because there's less equity available. But the general idea is when you're issuing tax-exempt private activity bonds, then you're actually able to lower your interest rate, which lowers your overall debt service. And the reduction in the debt service is what benefits the tenant and allows us to have more feasible and viable developments that have rents that are reduced. However, the quality of our developments are not reduced because it's going to cost what it's going to cost in order to develop a property. But at the end of the day, our goal is to lower rents to make it more affordable and provide essentially workforce housing to Texans. So now that the bond market has changed, interest rates are significantly low. And I guess with our last recovery bill that was signed by Congress, the tax credit, the 4% tax credit was as low, I believe, as 3.05%. It's now up to 4%, producing more equity, which will in turn allow us to provide more units that are affordable at lower levels to actually achieve more affordability for Texans who are at or below the 50% AMI level and likely reach more residents at 30% of the area median family income. So once we actually have all of our allocations going to the bond review board to receive a tax-exempt bond, the tax-exempt bond authority, then a local issuer, which would be TDHCA or some of your local housing finance corporations, or even cities could issue those bonds. All of the funding is converted through the sale of the bonds, and most of them end up with a Fannie Mae or an FHA type cover over them to make those bonds more secure, in addition to the equity from the 4% credits. So all of our developments are privately owned, which is important to understand. The housing provides for more mixed income and lowering the cost burden for our residents. And the overall picture of an affordable housing development, I think it's important to understand, is it's privately owned, it's Class A quality housing that we're actually building for residents. The only difference is the funding source and the fact that our residents are paying lower rents. So we do have various subsidies that are offered within our developments, but the majority of our housing is from working Texans who need reduced rents to prevent cost burden. So the reason why housing tax credits work is we have a large private sector financial investment, not a government-owned investment. The investors are not only screening and underwriting the developments to ensure the viability, but there is no risk to state and federal governments as it relates to these properties. So we do have credit enhancement, as I mentioned, on various developments, but those are available to market rate developers as well from a general financing perspective. But we are just offering an additional service that is essentially, as I mentioned previously, having less than a 1% default rate on those properties. So the extension of reduced rates and maintaining the affordability is what's truly making our impact on the state of Texas and on our residents. So as I mentioned, paying affordable rents is the #1 goal. The program was actually designed in 1986 to incentivize the development to provide lower rents. The majority of the properties remain on the property tax rolls, and it benefits the local jurisdiction in which the property is built, because it actually helps not only house those who should have an opportunity to live and work in various communities, but it also increases the economics of that local government and going forward as it relates to not only property taxes, but sales taxes from those residents who are living in our properties and actually engaging in typical community activities, whether they're working there or spending the money there that they have available because they are not cost burdened and housing burdened. So the benefit to the developer, obviously, we own the property, we do collect rents, and it's incumbent upon us. I think it's very important that everyone understand it's incumbent upon us to not only ensure that we have a quality development, but that quality development is maintained, because we have debt, as I mentioned, and the only way to get that debt paid is if we have rents and renters who are paying those rents, and we have an ongoing maintenance that is of a quality development for the neighborhoods, for the local jurisdictions, as well as for our residents. And the final benefit that happens is the investor who actually put the equity into the transaction is able to use those housing tax credits on their tax returns for the next 10 years. So they're investing in affordable housing and receiving the benefit, not on a dollar for dollar scale, but on the difference in what they pay for a tax credit and the value of that tax credit in the future. So they're able to use those housing tax credits to reduce their taxes on a long-term basis. So housing is a health issue. And in a pandemic, we not only have children and college students who are learning from home, we also have parents who are working from home with their children. So it's critically important to maintain safe, decent housing for children. Lisa mentioned earlier that the difference in a stable home is in a child's life is paramount, and they perform better long term. They are more likely to be educated in a secure environment when they feel secure at home. But because children are having to stay home more frequently because of the pandemic, it's important that the homes they are in are fortified, they're not only stable, they're secure, and that child feels good about where they live. In all of our properties, we're required to provide tenant services, and some of the services that we provide are critical and crucial. We have several properties that actually have daycare centers in them. So there's after-school care that's provided for our residents. Some of the services that are typically offered include financial literacy, health screening, job assistance in job searches, and it's just a general safe environment. There's a minimum number of amenities that have to be offered, but one of the main amenities that actually works quite well is our job centers and our business centers that are located on our properties, and internet services available, and the general community support that families receive is Class A. It's 100% a requirement to not only maintain our properties, but to maintain the health and well-being of our residents. So we're generally proud of what we do. We strive every day to ensure that we're building safe, decent, affordable housing, and it's workforce housing. So these families benefit greatly from the developments in each and every community. Lisa?
Okay. So affordable housing, as Thierry said, was established nationally in 1986. It's regulated under Section 42 of the IRS code. You may have heard it referred to as Section 42 housing, different from Section 8 housing. But in Texas, affordable housing is also governed by Section 2306 of our Texas statute. And as a state legislator, you have the ability to impact Section 2306. As Representative Thierry suggested earlier, TAAHP has looked at its legislative priorities and narrowed them down to 3 very specific items. And these 3 items are primarily small language changes that we would like to see in 2306, but they are language changes that could have a big impact on our ability to provide more housing in the state. Currently, it's estimated that about 270,000 families in Texas are housed by affordable housing, but there's an estimated need of almost 720,000 more units for low-income households. So the shortfall that Chris talked about earlier is significant, and the demand is significant. Next slide, please. As Thierry mentioned, we'll talk about the first legislative item. Thierry mentioned there are 2 main categories of housing tax credits, 9% credits and 4% credits. With a 4% housing tax credit transaction, Section 2306 of statute actually requires that an application receive a resolution of no objection from the local jurisdiction in which it is located. And that resolution has to be submitted as part of your application to the state for your 4% housing tax credits. Prior to the pandemic, failure to have this resolution would make your application ineligible. Next slide, please. During the pandemic, this item has actually been waived under an emergency declaration provision passed by the governor. And that essentially, since March of last year, the 4% housing tax credit program has been operating under that emergency declaration and without the resolutions of no objection, and done so successfully. As a result, one of the asks, or one of the items that TAAHP would like to see on its legislative agenda, is that these resolutions be removed as a requirement for your 4% application, and in lieu of a resolution, that we continue to provide notification to the local government or the local governing body. This modification to 2306 would actually streamline the requirement for a resolution. It also takes away some of the politically charged environments that occur when folks hear that affordable housing is coming into their community or their neighborhood. And it actually would allow housing to proceed on sites that are zoned appropriately for multifamily housing. Next slide, please. Another requirement in Texas statute is that TDHCA prioritize applications for funding in census tracts where there have been no other tax credit developments, or there haven't been tax credit developments in a significant number of years, 15 years or 30 years. Many times there are not any tax credit developments in a particular location because the demand may not be high enough to support it. And so at the end of the day, it's important to understand that these transactions are real estate transactions, and we are providing them in locations where there is sufficient demand for us to be able to rent them, fill the properties up, and pay the operating expenses and the debt associated with constructing them. So this section of statute was actually created to help incentivize dispersion of housing throughout the state. But the unintended consequence of this particular section is that we are unable to provide housing at higher levels where the population is more dense. And instead, we're incentivized to go to where there has never been a development before, where there hasn't been a development in many, many years. And the population areas may not be as dense there. So this means that affordable housing is not necessarily being provided in the areas of highest need. And it's important that, particularly with the pandemic and COVID-19, that right now we are looking at where is the highest need and how can we get the most units of housing correlated with where the population needs are the highest. The TAAHP recommendation for changing Section 2306 would be to actually remove this particular language from the statute and allow other criteria that already exist that address dispersion in the qualified allocation plan to dictate how location is scored for an application. And next slide. Texas in particular is unique nationally because it is the state that is the most heavily regulated by statute as it relates to affordable housing. Many states actually allow their state agencies to direct how their housing policy is created and carried out and what their priorities are. In Texas, under Section 2306, statute actually dictates exactly how scoring is to be handled by the agency. When you look at that and you combine it with the 2-year meeting schedule for our legislature, it really limits the agency's opportunity to be nimble in addressing needs, in meeting new demand, in dealing with issues like the pandemic. As Thierry mentioned, the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs is the agency that is responsible for carrying out affordable housing programs in Texas. It's a state agency. And TAAHP believes that allowing that agency more latitude in setting flexibility, in setting priorities, would actually provide more flexibility than we have today. Next slide. Currently, Section 2306 actually sets forth the criteria that TDHCA is mandated to follow it in a descending priority order. Next slide. TAAHP's recommendation would be, rather than to mandate that TDHCA follow the exact order, but that the agency consider the scoring criteria when creating their policy each year, and even perhaps to allow the agency to reorder the priorities depending on the particular needs or policy objectives. And next slide. As I mentioned, TAAHP has really focused on what we feel is a very streamlined legislative agenda with 3 primary areas that we are looking at. And each of those areas is looked at with a goal of being able to put more housing on the ground, particularly in the areas where the need is the highest. If you're interested in learning more about any of these legislative agendas, feel free to reach out to TAAHP or any of its board members or any of us on the Governmental Affairs Committee, and we'd be happy to visit with you one-on-one, provide you some more information, or answer any questions you might have. And that concludes our presentation. I will turn it back over to Roger.
Thank you, Terry and Lisa. You guys did a fantastic job of taking what many see as a very complicated issue and really putting it into bite-sized chunks that most people can understand, especially for our policymakers that impact such a critical aspect of the Texas economy through affordable housing. So I just want to tell our listeners and our viewers a little bit about who we are. TAAHP is the Texas Affiliation of Affordable Housing Providers. We've been around about 24 years. And what's critical for you to know about us is that for all the different policy initiatives that you're going to be hearing this session regarding affordable housing, it is this organization and our members that actually put it on the ground. They are the funders. They are the developers, the designers, the architects, the legal staff, property managers, anybody that has anything to do with how they work and how these Class A developments are put onto the ground, and they serve families of limited means and limited incomes. It goes through, and we have experts on our board and in our membership that understand these aspects. So that's what's critical to know about us. We want to serve as a resource for our elected officials and for anyone else that may have questions about how these affordable housing programs work in Texas. So that's who we are. And if we'll just move on, I'll just quickly run through a couple of slides here to show you who we're talking about and the list of members that we have in our board for this year. These are all people that are experts in their fields. They represent different aspects of the industry as well. And with that, we'll run through the rest of our board. I want to give everybody some time to see who represents us. All very critical people that you may have seen and will likely hear from when it comes time for these letters of support from state representatives. With that, let me just wrap up and see if there are any questions. And if there are, we'll certainly happily facilitate them with our speakers. We'll give it just a minute. You can put your questions into the chat box or into the question box, and we're happy to respond to them if you've got any. As you are considering any questions, let me also thank, while we're here, Senator Vanderpute, Chairman Keffer, for their efforts in helping us make this program a success. Thanks again to Representative Thierry for joining us, and to our presenters, Lisa Stevens and Terry Anderson, and the TAAHP staff for all their hard work in putting all of these pieces together, and of course our sponsors for making this program possible. And last but not least, we want to thank you for participating with us today. Again, as Lisa and Terry said, we remain available to you and happy to answer any questions, not just now, but throughout the session. You've got my contact information there, and I'm happy to facilitate, especially as you're getting into the legislative season and have any questions or concerns about housing proposals that are put out there into the public. For those that are TAAHP listeners listening in, or TAAHP members listening in, please mark your calendars. Our next event is on February 10th. You can find more information on this event and sponsorship opportunities at taahp.org.